Alright, we're back. The greatest podcast of all time. Now you might actually listen to this on YouTube or elsewhere. I thought it would be an ever so humble Christmas gift, a Yule gift from me to have this public instead of only having it on Subscribestar and Gumroad as I usually have. Of course, big shout out to my OG supporters on Gumroad and Subscribestar. Now anyway, as you see in the title of this video, of this podcast episode, we're gonna talk about the cultured thug. So we'll get into it in a little bit, but first a few updates. A lot is going on in the world as we speak. Now, if you haven't listened to any of my podcast episodes before, usually I give a few updates on different things. So it can be political happenings, it can be a training update, a health update, a fatherhood update, a book update, whatever it might be. So I usually get into the main topic or topics at hand after I have come with my updates. But now we're gonna start off straight into it. We're gonna talk about the cultured thug, then we're gonna talk about a few different updates, and then we're gonna get into a book with a similar name, The Cultured Thug Handbook, because I've read it and I can definitely recommend it. So we're gonna talk a bit about it and some of the insights presented therein. It's a very good book to begin with if you're new to right-wing thought or illiberal thought or reactionary thought, if you prefer that term, no matter what you want to call yourself. If you have a sense that something is off with the current political zeitgeist, so default liberalism as you can call it, then you can definitely read this book so you understand what is going on. So that can be a suitable Christmas gift, a Yule gift to someone you know, The Cultured Thug Handbook. Speaking of which, of course, I would highly encourage you, if you want to support my holy work and if you want to spread the good message of hope, positivity and high thumos, you can give a copy of Dauntless, a copy of Demigod Mentality and a copy of Old World Feast to someone dear to you. So if you're an enjoyer of my work and you would like to see more people engage with my teachings, then place an order of a few books and then you can give it out during this Yule to various individuals you would like to partake of my teachings. Now anyway, on to the cultured thug. This is a quite easy concept to understand if you have been with me for a few years. Explained in the most simple way possible, it's a combination of brains and brawn, so that you have, a physical capacity and you also have an intellectual capacity, a mental capacity. So the term, it comes from a quote by the late and great Jonathan Bowden. And he said in a speech of his, he was a phenomenal speaker, by the way, so you can look at some speeches of him on YouTube if you aren't familiar with Jonathan Bowden. Anyway, here is the quote. "Truthfully, in this age, those with intellect have no courage, and those with some modicum of physical courage have no intellect. If things are to alter during the next 50 years, then we must re-embrace Byron's ideal, the cultured thug." End quote. So he's referring to a sensitive young man, none other than Lord Byron. So he was born in 1788 and died at a young age, at 1824. So he was a poet and an adventurer and overall a cultured man. So anyway, he wrote in some of his poems, he had an ideal, which then Jonathan Bowden labeled as the cultured thug. So to give a few examples, a few literary examples, you can think of a pirate captain who is a fan of the opera or something like that. So it's a thug, obviously, if it's a pirate captain, so he has an affinity for physical action, violence, everything like that, but he also has a cultured side, so he appreciates fine art and literature and the good stuff. So that is something you can perhaps stumble upon if you read poems every once in a while. And this, by the way, this has been the ideal in Europe since forever, basically. So you have this man of action who's physically capable, but who can also use his mind to accomplish things. And what Jonathan Bowden warns against then is the thug, someone who's only has physical courage but no intellect. So you can think of a stereotypical football hooligan or something like that, someone who only has the thug within him. And then you have the bookish dork, someone who's only concerned with the intellectual and he doesn't have any physical capacity at all. And as I mentioned in a recent video of mine when we're talking about politics and biology, we know that your physiology, it impacts your political views. So a healthy mind in a healthy body, and many of these dorks, they are, they have a strange worldview simply because they aren't well in their bodies. So anyway, the cultured thug is someone who embodies both an action-oriented aspect and a contemplation-oriented aspect, and he can combine the two into a successful whole. Now then, how to become a cultured thug, you might ask? Yes, it is simply a matter of reading books and training MMA. So, reading books, can it be any type of book, you ask? Well, it should optimally be something that expands your knowledge about things, but even just reading for the sake of it is good for you to train language, and this can be any language. Now, a note on language and the use of words being as effective as possible at communicating. This is of utmost importance when it comes to winning the metapolitical battle. So I might have said this a few times before, but I'll say it again because it's so important. You should train some sort of martial art to be able to punch as hard as possible. Now, what is even more important is for you to be as effective with your tongue and pen as possible. And with tongue and pen, I of course mean your ability to communicate as effectively as possible. So keep that phrase in mind. This is of utmost importance when it comes to winning. Now, it's not the only thing, but if we're talking about fighting and taking battles and everything, back in the day you put on your armor and you grabbed your sword and you went out to fight, but now the fight looks a bit different, to be sure. So yes, not as heroic to post on X, to compose an argument on Twitter as it is to put on your armor to go out and fight invading Mongols or whatever it might be, but this is how reality looks, and I'm not out for any heroics. I'm out for winning so we can restore order for the sake of our children's future. So that is what's at stake, and then we need to look at what is going on. And yes, it's super important to be able to communicate our ideas as effectively as possible. Speaking of which, we can go to a metapolitical update. Now we have gotten the term remigration into the debate. So good work everyone. Now anyway, the cultured thug. So we have the cultured aspect, and that's in this case primarily to do with being able to argue for your political views and your worldview. So of course you can also, gain an appreciation for high culture, which I suggest you do anyway for your own enjoyment, but the cultured thug in this particular context means someone who can argue for his worldview. And of course, the more knowledgeable you are, the more well-read you are, the heavier your argument will hit. So it's the same thing as if we're talking about boxing, striking. So if you have a lot of mass to put behind your punch, then it's better. So you can view it in that sense that, your knowledge is your mass, your muscle mass, and then how effectively you can communicate that knowledge, that is your technique. So if you want to be able to punch as hard as possible, then train technique and then also put some mass behind it. Then you will have some true knockout power. And again, same thing goes when it comes to presenting a worldview that can be attractive to as many people as possible. So anyway, the cultured thug, someone who has both. Someone who is both action-oriented and someone who has some good thoughts to share with the world. So this is the ideal you should strive for. So, be as well-read as possible. I've read mostly historical books, because that, in my humble opinion, that gives you a very good understanding of the world, and you can predict the future in a better way when you see these cycles coming and going. And I've talked about Oswald Spengler before. I said in an interview with our esteemed friend Uberboy that I tortured myself by reading both volumes of Decline of the West. Now, and of course I made a podcast episode about Decline of the West and the cycles of history, so you can check that out at Gumroad or Subscribestar if you want. But what I can say now is that even though I'm not a big fan of Oswald Spengler, I have to, admit, I have to give him his due that his theory of cycles of civilization, it's very useful indeed. So if you look at these cycles, you sort of know what is about to come and where we are in the cycle. So right now we are, one could argue, at the end of a cycle, of a civilizational cycle, and then we can decide, okay, what do we let die this particular civilizational winter? And yeah, it's quite clear we let many ills of modernity, such as liberalism, and if we're talking about, promiscuity and sexual morals, loose sexual morals, that we can let die off, and then we can recreate something. We can be reborn into something new come spring, so come the civilizational spring. So that's also what we're working towards here in the great metapolitical struggle, that we present a beautiful vision to work towards. So Western civilization is not bound to death, but it's bound to be reborn into something completely else, because the current paradigm is it's going under, simply put. Now then, you might ask how to become a thug. So I've said how to become more cultured, and that is simply the absolutely simplest way to explain it is to become as knowledgeable as possible. How to become a thug, and this is something I've talked about so many times before, so I'll keep it short, but simply put, go and train some martial arts. If you can't train any martial arts because you don't have any club nearby, then at least train with the weights, put on some size and mass, but I would definitely encourage everyone to at least try to train some martial arts at some stage. Do try some sparring. Optimally speaking, you should go some sort of fight as well. That is a true test of character, because, if you are fighting against another man, there are few things that are as primally dangerous as going into such a fight, because you can get subjugated by another man physically. So it has nothing to do with pain, because your adrenaline will negate all pain, so it doesn't have anything to do with that, but it has to do with the fact that the very essence of your being is rightly afraid of losing physically to another man in the realest way possible. You can lose a game, you can lose a match, you can lose something, but if you lose in an actual fight against another man, it will be a hard pill to swallow. So that's something you can keep in mind if you want training motivation, that training is hard, but losing is a lot harder. So do keep that in mind, and if you do step up, if you do manage to overcome your fears, you have my respect, no matter if you win or lose. Of course, you should always try to win, do everything you can to win, which means to train as hard as possible, prepare as well as possible. But anyway, however it goes, you have my respect, because you defeated your inner demon that says to you to not engage, to not embrace life. So this is perhaps the hardest fight you can take, and this is then the cultured thug winning over the bookish nerd, because the bookish nerd, he says to you, you shouldn't fight because you could lose, or you shouldn't take risks because this and that. But sometimes you have to put yourself out, you have to take these risks, and this is also the hallmark of a cultured thug, that he is willing to take a risk, but before taking said risks, he is also calculating and optimizing everything so that the chances of success are as high as possible. Now, even if you don't sign up for any type of fight, you should still try to train as much as possible, and this is not only to be safe on the mean streets of Gotham City. By the way, this is of course something you should train so you can protect yourself and your loved ones. So every man should be able to have the basics in order, at least. So be able to throw a combination, a jab, cross, hook, or something like that. And some grappling is always good. So the very practical aspect of it, very important indeed. But we're also come to the psychological aspect of training martial arts in particular, and that is that you will be able to stand up for yourself in a more effortless fashion. So if you don't train anything at all, if you don't have any contact with those primordial energies, then you will be easier to push around, basically. And this is something you can see if you look at the archetypal bugman, so a default liberal. He has those views because he's unhealthy and he's been bullied into believing that. So he's bullied into believing that mass immigration from the third world is good because the food is good. Everyone understands this is a cope because he's ultimately a coward. So the cure, the very physiological cure for cowardice, is simply to train in such a way that your hormones will make you braver. So if you train Thai boxing on a regular basis, you will be more inclined to stand up for yourself in any given situation, including something like a political arguments. Now, of course, don't get me wrong here, there are plenty of guys who are very good at fighting, physical fighting, but they are still complete cowards. Same thing when it comes to powerlifting. There are many big, strong guys who are absolute pussies when push comes to shove. But in generally speaking, the more in tune you are with primordial energies, the more likely you are to be able to stand up to pressure. So you will be pressured. The pressure can come from whatever it might be. It can be an argument you have with your professor at the university, so definitely not a violent situation or anything like that, but the willingness to confront injustice. So if you have a professor who says that, white men are evil, or how it goes, then if you have trained a lot, then you are more likely to be able to stand up and say, you know what, you are wrong because white men are great, or something like that. Now, of course, there are plenty of guys, they haven't trained a day in their lives, and they still are very good at taking confrontations, so I'm painting with a very broad brush here, and this is very general recommendations, very general advice here I'm giving. But long story short, the more you train, the more help from your physiology, the more help you will have from your hormones to battle insecurities. Similarly, if you have any type of issue that gnaws at you, that makes you uneasy, then if you go and train heavy, the endorphins, they will take care of it, and then your problems, they will not seem so big anymore. Now then, on to one of the most commonly asked questions I get, and that is, what martial art should I start training? And I always give the same answer, and that is whichever is easiest for you to incorporate into your everyday life. So if you live 10 minutes from a boxing club, then do train boxing, no question about it at all. If you have 5 minutes to a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu club, do train there, no question at all either. So it's about what is easiest for you to incorporate in your everyday life. Now, if that is not an issue, if you have, different clubs within an equal distance, then I would go with MMA, so you get everything. But keep in mind that just as in the gym, you want to focus on the basic compound movements. Same thing when it comes to martial arts, you want to focus on the basics. So learn how to throw a cross, a hook, learn some basic head movement, foot movement, and that you will probably get no matter if you train, boxing or MMA or Thai boxing. Of course, the footwork will look a bit different in Thai boxing versus boxing because your stance is completely different. But you know what I mean. The important thing is to get some sort of basics in place first and foremost, and then you can look at different gyms later on. So, long story short, train whichever is easiest for you to train on a regular basis. Now, speaking of which, I haven't actually trained grappling in quite a while now, and the reason for that is quite simple. The training sessions, they were too late in the evening, so they would interfere with my fatherhood routine, which consists of playing with Legos and reading stories for my elder daughter. And of course, if I come home too late, it will be hard for me to find the calm I need before going to sleep as well. So that is at least why I don't train at that particular club anymore. Otherwise, it's a super nice club. But it's how it goes. So I train in the gym instead, and I train the occasional Thai boxing and boxing whenever it fits into my everyday life. Now, on to an ever so brief training update. I'm continuing with the Russian squat routine, which you have perhaps seen, since I have posted physique from the Temple of Iron, and I do some good old squats. Now, I look forward to getting back to the deadlift, of course, but I will say the squats, this time around, they have really activated the presence of the primordial beast. So I feel powerful, I feel good, it feels great, mate. So squats, definitely a great exercise, and as I've mentioned a few times before, they have a great carryover effect to the deadlift. So I don't train any deadlifts right now because I don't want to jeopardize my elbow, which it feels fine now, by the way, but I'm taking it easy. So I don't do any deadlifts at the moment, but I know that when I will get back to them, the strength I've gained in the squats, it will help greatly. So deadlifts are incoming, hopefully in good time for spring, so I can get in an amazing shape for summer, so I can post physique and posting physique is at this moment in time. It's a political statement in itself. So if you post physique and you look jacked and healthy and good, people will automatically assume that you have good political opinions, which of course it's true, because as we said in a recent video, they are connected. Now on to the main topic of this fine podcast. We're gonna talk about Mike Maxwell's The Cultured Thug Handbook. And we'll start off with a quote in the introduction. I thought it was quite good indeed. So here it goes. The cultured thug can bench 225. He can cook a decent steak. He knows at least one martial art. He owns and can handle a weapon. He can give orders because people will listen, and he can take orders because he doesn't have a chip on his shoulder. He has a family, or at least he wants a family, and not just weekend trips to Bali until he dies alone and unwept amid a collection of Marvel action figures. What the cultured thug doesn't have, however, is the time to read 1,000 pages just to understand Spengler, although he should do that. That's where this book comes in. The cultured thug is not a new thing, it is something very old. In fact, the further back you go, the more often you meet him. Quite a nice quote indeed. Now, of course, I need to say that I'm no longer a cultured thug, because I did read 1,000 pages of Spengler to understand his cyclical theory, so I thought it was fun to mention that as well. But yeah, just on a side note here, I do not recommend anyone, unless you're very interested in Spengler, I don't really recommend you taking the time, because it took me a month, the entire month of August, to get through the both volumes, and I could have invested that time more wisely, read other books. But anyway, that is not the point of the quote, that is not the point of me sharing the quote, I just thought to mention it for fun. And also a quick note on Marvel action figures. True cultured thugs do of course enjoy historical Playmobil figurines. I have a Martin Luther collector's edition that I got a few years ago from my good friend Don, so big shout out and thank you to you, Don, for that royal gift. I still have it with me. So good stuff, good stuff. Anyway, that was a good quote describing what a cultured thug is. So the opposite of a bugman, basically. Someone who knows how to do a lot of things, someone who has enough gravitas to give orders, someone who has enough humility to understand when he is not the one in charge. This is a different topic, we might return to it, but in a company of mature men, there isn't really an alpha who's always an alpha, but the hierarchy, it's dynamic, so sometimes you just have to say that you know best, so you take the wheel now and you decide what is going on, and then in a different situation, some other guy might take the command, because in this particular situation, he knows best. We'll return to it another time, but I just want to say that because some people, they have this very outdated view of masculinity, that you have an alpha male who's always in charge and always knows best. So the optimal leadership, at least when we're talking about in an Aryan context and an Indo-European, in a European context, is that you have a first among equals, a leader who is preferably chosen by other men based on his competence, based on his divine intuition, based on trust. So that is the leader in a specific situation, but then you should always have the humility to submit to something higher, and this also goes into the divine right of kings, by the way, that the king is also beholden to God, or to the gods, or at least a higher principle. So the manly thing is to be able to submit to something higher. What is very unmanly, what is very childish, immature, is to be someone who has an issue, has problems with submitting to a hierarchy, and you can't work with these people. Then you have complete chaos. I will share a quote here from General Patton. "Lead me, follow me, or get hell out of my way." So that is a quite good insight indeed. Now moving on to the next point, and this is from Chapter 9, titled Darwin and the Work of Circumstances. And I will quote here as well, because it's very, very nicely put, very nicely formulated. So shout out again to the author Mike Maxwell. And I quote, "The oldest, strongest and most consequential things, patriarchy, ethnocentrism, traditional sexual roles, the family, authoritarianism, and above all, hierarchy, must be deferred to. not because they are good, but because they are the source of all good, because without them we don't even have a society in the first place, because a thing can't be good unless it first is. End quote. Very profound indeed. Now, in the summary of this chapter, he also notes that we don't draw practice from theory, we draw theory from what works. Traditions are group evolutionary strategies, and nothing can be good that does not exist. So this is absolutely crucial to keep in mind. So if we're talking about something like female promiscuity, so something that has been shunned throughout all ages in all cultures. And to just give a quick explanation why it's so catastrophic, it's because if you have a low paternal certainty, then you will have a low paternal investment, and simply put, a father who doesn't care about his offspring because he doesn't know if it's actually his offspring, if he doesn't invest time, energy, resources in them, they will not have a good life outcome. You can look at the catastrophe of single motherhood for reference. So basically, when a man doesn't invest in the future of a society, then chaos ensues. So it's an absolute danger to accept female promiscuity, which is why it has always been tightly controlled. And this is also something that we wouldn't have a nice civilization, everything good would have simply not existed had we accepted female promiscuity. So we have traditional gender roles for a reason. So these traditions, they aren't there because we want to oppress women by not letting them sleep around or whatever. We do have this in place because we know that the alternative is to have complete and utter chaos and to not have any civilization at all. So it's similar as to, we punish male aggression. We can't have men going around beating up other men because it's, not a good way to run a society, and we know that it will simply not last, it will not work. So all of these traditions we have, so the nuclear family, traditional gender roles, they are there for a reason, and because we have them in place, then we can have good things, and when you remove these things, then bad things come in its stead. So evolutionary strategy to create a good society, that is what these traditions are. And then you have the eternal ongoing revolt of the left against all traditional institutions and traditions. And if you will permit me to schizomax a bit, when they remove these shields of humanity, they invite demons, and then you have an absolute catastrophe like we have now. So instead of beautiful love stories, we have OnlyFans and pornography and promiscuity and all manner of ills. So to yet again mention the civilizational cycles, so this winter promiscuity and degenerate sexual morals, they will wither and die, and then come spring, come civilizational spring, love and sacred sexuality will be reborn. So the sacred union of man and women. Because something to keep in mind here as well is that most people, they probably have less sex today. And that is of course related to the fact that many people, they aren't married, they aren't in a stable relationship. So if we want people to be sexually stimulated, then marriage is the way to go. Excuse my perhaps vulgarity in talking about these issues, but it is quite important when we're talking about the health of our civilization, because at the moment it is absolutely not healthy in the least with all of this aforementioned ills. Now, that was one example of a tradition, of a cultural norm that has been in place since time immemorial, and that is the reason for it. So traditions aren't just something you take with you because they are there for a reason, and they should be there for a reason, and remove them at your own peril. Now on to a short music break, and we'll be back with the next point. Alright, always good with some medieval Total War 2 music to get the blood going. So, on to the next point, and we turn to chapter 14, titled Bioleninism, and this is also related to a previous chapter, which, again, I have discussed in a recent video titled Politics is Biology, so long story short, there, since I already made a video on it, I will not elaborate on it in this particular podcast. But to summarize, if you are healthy, if you have a healthy body, you have a healthy mind, and then you will have healthy political views. So right-wing, conservative, nationalism, whatever you want to label it as. So normal, healthy views that people have had for forever, basically. Now, anyway, on to the chapter titled Bioleninism. We have a quote here from the author again, and I quote, "Bioleninism is just Leninism with a new firmware update. Promote the dregs not of class, but of biology." So, the original Leninism is of course a revolt of the social class, so the underclass against what you had in Russia, the ruling caste, and it culminated with the most tragic execution of the Tsar and his family, something that makes me angry to this day. And keep in mind, Russia is a traditional enemy of Sweden, so it's not like I have any particular love for the Tsar, but still, it should annoy, it should make any sane man angry to see the dregs of society then treat the Tsar and his family in such a way. I will probably make a few episodes on the Russian Civil War and the Bolshevik Revolution at some other time, but anyway, what we mean with Leninism is the revolt then of the lower classes, and Bioleninism means that it's not necessarily about your social class, but of a biological class. So you can have an Antifa member, and that individual might be from a very well-off family, and this is actually quite common to see. You know, an individual with wealthy parents, but not so biologically speaking high quality, to put it in such a way. I don't want to be crude, I don't want to be mean towards anyone, but if I am going to be mean against someone, it would be some sort of left-wing extremist. So we can say someone who is not particularly physically impressive. That's a nice and kind way to put it. Now then, this individual, he or she, they want revenge against the strapping, handsome young white man. So it doesn't matter if that particular young man, he might be from a working class background or whatever. So it's not about physical means, but it's about biological means. So the well-to-do, the well-off Antifa member might have such a raging inferiority complex against this strapping young handsome white man that the revolt, it goes on, and he or she just wants to continue to make life hell for the strapping young handsome white man, because that's a way for them to get back at them. So Bioleninism, it's still just like all communism, I suppose. It's a matter of revenge, of ressentiment, of getting back at the ones they perceive as having slighted them. So the young, handsome, sensitive white man, he might not have done anything at all, but just by existing, that is a slight enough, because then this other individual, this individual filled with hate and resentment, he will feel inferior, and that is being perceived as a slight. So the only way he can cope with that is to lash out against the well-adjusted individual. And I will share a legendary quote, the greatest quote of all time. So this is by Forgotten Mystery Grove on X, and he says, "Reminder, communism is when ugly, deformed freaks make it illegal to be normal, then rob and or kill all successful people out of petty resentment and cruelty. The ideology is all just window dressing." Now, I'm quoting him. This is not me saying this myself, but I thought it was a fun way to explain the psychology of communism, or in this case, Bioleninism. Now, a lot more can be said about it, but let's move on to the next point. We turn to chapter 18, titled Corporatism. And I will begin with a profound quote. I actually shared it on Telegram and X, so perhaps you've already seen it. But anyway, here goes. "Communism and corporatism are mortal enemies. Communism is class conflict. Corporatism is class collaboration. The two could hardly be more different. Under corporatism, the whole comes before the part. For Marx, the part comes first, the class is above all. In fact, with Marx, the part aspires to become the whole through the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's the same with liberalism. For John Locke, it's the individual above all. This relationship between part and whole has been called social ontology. Liberalism and communism are cousins because they share the same social ontology. The part comes first. Corporatism puts the whole first. And I'm skipping ahead to the next page, continuing with the quote. Ironically given its name, the first thing corporatism does is to put a leash on corporations like Google and BlackRock, no matter how much money they have. A lot of people want to get money out of politics, and that is coming from a good place. But it's also a bit naive. Money and politics are always entangled. You can't separate them. It's a matter of which calls the shots. And skipping ahead on the page, under capitalism, money has a leash on politics. Under corporatism, politics has a leash on money. End quote. Now, for those of you who have read Dauntless, you will be familiar with my term national capitalism. It was just a nice title I put on my own view of money, basically money in relation to politics. So, of course, I'm all for entrepreneurship and the free market, so to speak. But the free market is only free as long as it does good. So as soon as someone does something bad, then the state will crack down with an iron fist. So on such a thing as pornography or, tormenting animals or something like that. So the state always says what is going on. So the big corporations, the big companies, they do not call the shots. But as Mike says here, corporatism, politics and not money should call the shots. So in my view, and this is something I want to see happen in Sweden when our guys get into power, is that the ability for entrepreneurs to realize their dreams, passions, projects, that should be as easy as possible. And at the same time, if someone does something bad, then the state comes in to put an end to it. So to give an example, Meta should not be able to remove my Instagram accounts or Facebook accounts because they feel like it. So the Swedish state should have, had we had proper men in charge, the Swedish state would have said to Meta that, you can't do this, because if you do, then negative consequences will come to you in terms of, shutting down server halls or whatever it might be. Because ultimately the state, in an optimal scenario, a divinely inspired king, an enlightened despot, he should be a father to his people, and you can't let others come in to mistreat your children. You can't let others come in to mistreat your citizens, your people, simply put. So that is what should have been done, and it will definitely be done in the future. Again, when our guys are in positions of power, then these big companies, they know that they will have to stick by the rules. They can't mistreat citizens as they wish. They have to be accountable to something, and this can only be done with a strong state in hand, and not a state which is bullied by big companies. Now, of course, this also depends on the strength of the state itself, but if you're a small state, then it might be good to be part of a bigger union. So that's why I am an appreciator of the EU, not the EU as it looks today, but this is a very limited mindset if you believe that the EU necessarily has to look the way it does today. The EU could become something great and glorious if we had the right people in these positions of power, and that is why I say to all sensitive young men here in Europe that go into politics, imagine what we could achieve if we had our guys in Brussels and in Strasbourg. Moving on to the next point, chapter 22, Anarcho-tyranny, and I suppose most of you are, alas, unfortunately, you are intimately familiar with the concept of anarcho-tyranny because you probably live under anarcho-tyranny, and especially if you live in the UK, beautiful Britannia, Albion, merry old England. It's a sad tale. So much creative potential is there. I always defend the good name of England. I am very thankful for all of the good things that Great Britain has given to the world. I'm especially thinking about Tolkien and Warhammer on a very personal note, but then of course very many inventions that make our lives better. They originate from the British Isles. Anyway, anarcho-tyranny is simply put when you have anarchy on one side, which means that you let certain groups in society run rampant, such as, okay, I'm posting this to YouTube, so I'm not gonna go into any specific details, because also here I'm checking in from Sweden, and we also have anarcho-tyranny to a certain extent. So that means we have laws such as we have hate speech laws. So we don't have freedom of speech. So I can't say if there is a particular group that has done something, because I risk jail if I do. So that is a good example, very suitable, that I can actually point to a direct example here when we're talking about anarcho-tyranny. So anyway, it's about letting some groups in society run rampant. Criminal gangs, so we can take an example that will not get me into trouble with the law. We can look at Gotham City. So you have widespread lawlessness, so anarchy, but then you have anarcho-tyranny, and the tyranny is aimed at normal citizens, law-abiding good citizens such as yours truly. So that means they will crack down very hard on me if I say something they don't like. And this, of course, it also has to do with them viewing me as a threat for power, because I challenge their right to rule. Simply put, I challenge the current regime. And of course, I'm hardly the only one who is doing so. So anyway, anarcho-tyranny, it combines two very bad things. So anarchy for certain groups and tyranny for other groups. So you can find plenty of examples of, a grandmother has written something angrily on Facebook because she has gotten robbed 5 times in a row by third world immigrants, so therefore she writes something angrily on Facebook, and then a few days later the police shows up to her door to arrest her, to jail her for hate speech or something. I'm just using one example, but you can unfortunately, you can find many of these examples throughout the West, especially in, again, such a place as the UK, but also in Germany, also in Sweden. And this is then happening at the same time as you have hand grenades are being thrown into shopping malls and houses and the like, such as we have in Sweden. So that can explain anarcho-tyranny. It's quite easy to understand since we literally live under anarcho-tyranny. Now, moving on to the next point. Chapter 28, Heraclitus, Differential Ontology. And I am again quoting from the book. And recognition of difference goes hand in hand with pattern recognition, stereotypes, and generalizations, which we'll discuss in the next chapter. Difference is a more masculine worldview, because men are better at seeing differences and generalizing, and women at seeing similarity and individual empathy. End quote. So, a short passage there, but something that is of utmost importance for understanding why the West looks the way it does today, and especially when it comes to explaining why women have been so susceptible to accepting the notion that mass immigration from the third world would be a good idea. So if you have a harder time generalizing, it will be, of course, harder to understand why mass immigration from the Middle East might be a bad idea. Now, I will actually say something positive about the Middle East, and that is that you have many good Middle Eastern men, both today and historically speaking. And this is especially important to point out when we are talking about philosophy and religion and historical matters, simply put, because it would be a shame to completely write off that part of the world, because they have had talented men throughout the centuries. So I will humbly admit that. I will definitely say that is the case, and even today there are many good men from that part of the world. Definitely, I can't say otherwise and be truthful with myself. So that being said, when it comes to politics, we have to generalize, because if we don't generalize when it comes to large-scale societal issues, then we're in for a world of trouble. We can't judge a people based on a few outliers. We can't say, I know this individual, he's from this country and he's really a great guy. We need to look at the general trend, we need to look at the pattern and look beyond the exceptions. So therefore we can say that mass immigration from the Middle East into Europe has been an unmitigated catastrophe, and it needs to be reversed by mass remigration. That is the truth of the matter. So I can keep two things in mind at the same time. So I can say that there are talented and good men from the Middle East, especially historically speaking, but we should absolutely not accept immigration from the Middle East. Now, to use another example of pattern recognition, we can talk about criminals. So, criminals no matter of race or ethnicity. So, the criminal physiology, the criminal biology is someone with perhaps high testosterone, low intelligence, low impulse control, lack of empathy. So there you have a concoction that will make a man more prone to criminality. So a man would then say that this thug, so thug in the actual bad sense, so we're not talking about the cultured thug anymore, we're not talking about a man of action, but we're talking about a petty criminal, someone with low impulse control who hurts others. So a man will say, this individual, he will never amount to anything good, because we've seen 100 times before this personality type with low intelligence, low impulse control, and zero empathy. He's not good for society, we can't really do anything about him, so throw him into prison, and if he's from a different nation, then repatriate him as soon as possible. Now, a woman, I would say actually an unhealthy woman, because a healthy woman with children and healthy instincts, her instinct is to protect her children, and then you can't have the criminal archetype running around in society, because that is a threat to her and her children. So I would say an unhealthy woman who has a misplaced maternal instinct, she will look at a criminal and pity him and say he has gone through a lot of tough times, and she will try to come up with ways to fix him. She wants to fix him. And this is, by the way, something fun. You can look at something like pit bulls. You have individuals who think that the behavior of a pit bull is up to the owner, which of course to a certain extent it is, but the pit bull is still a dangerous dog bred for fighting. That is what it is. So that is its very nature. And then you still have individuals who will say that they are the sweetest angels on earth. Now, I understand perfectly well if you have a pit bull, if you live in Gotham City and you don't have access to any other weapons, but it is a weapon, it is not a pet. A pit bull is a weapon. So, different topic, but I just wanted to mention it because the psychology of the misplaced maternal instinct is still there. So, an unhealthy woman, she can place her maternal instinct onto criminals or onto pit bulls in a bad situation. So anyway, when this impulse, when this instinct is being left to govern, then you will have, instead of capital punishment or long prison sentences, you will have therapy. This hardened criminal, he needs to go to therapy to be able to come back as a normal and productive member of society. So they believe it can actually be fixed, but a proper man with a fully functional brain, he will see that this particular pattern, it will only ever lead to this particular outcome. Yes, there are of course exceptions. Some might be able to, overcome their nature and become something good, but in most situations that is not the case. And again, the main point here is that laws, they need to be in place for what is the general rule, not the exception. So we look at the trend, we look at the pattern, and thereby we create the rules. We don't look at these exceptions. So we see that this particular personality type, he will probably not fix himself. Society can't fix him because the mental hardware, it is not there. You can't teach someone empathy, in most cases at least. You can't teach someone to have a better impulse control in most situations. So it is really hard to change someone. And this brings us into the fundamental battle of ideas of our time. Tabula rasa liberalism versus the right worldview. So tabula rasa liberalism means that a human is born as a blank slate, and you can write your own story. And if you are a bit wiser than that, to put it mildly, you understand that this notion it's so laughable that I don't even find words to describe how insane it is. A more reasonable metaphor would be to say that you have a few lines to write on a book that is already 1,000 pages long. You are your ancestors and your biological hardware. Yes, you can refine it to the best of your abilities, but ultimately you have to humbly accept the fact that you are but a part of a very long line stretching back through the mists of time. Now, this is very important to point out whenever we're talking about mass immigration, because if you truly believe that tabula rasa liberalism is correct, if you truly believe that each human is born as a blank slate, then mass immigration, it could make sense, because then they could become like us. Now, of course, we know that this is not the case. You can't bring in vastly different peoples into a new country and expect them to become like us simply by learning the correct values. And this is also why civic nationalism is such a dorky delusion. So if you become part of a nation by accepting its cultural norms. Now, of course, there are individuals from different parts of the world. They can become valued members of a new society. Definitely, that can happen. But when it comes to, again, a large scale, it is absolutely not possible and absolutely not desirable in the least. Anyway, most of you are already familiar with all of this, so we'll get on to the next point. And we turn to chapter 30, Confucius, the rectification of names. And I quote from the beginning of the chapter. The idea that words shape our reality is often thought of as a left-wing view, as a sort of cultural relativism. But two things should give us pause before accepting that this really is a left-wing view. First, that cultural relativism has been cynically abandoned by the left for universal principles like human rights and democracy. And second, the idea that words shape reality was championed by one of the most conservative thinkers who ever lived, Confucius. End quote. Now I'll get straight into what I label as word magic. And if you have listened to this podcast, over 50 episodes by now, by the way. Good work, myself, if I may be so bold as to pat myself on the back for this achievement. And also, of course, if you have read Demigod Mentality, you will understand what I mean here. So yes, most definitely, the words you use, they will have a great impact on everything. So, for me personally, I only ever use good words, glorious words, words that will be uplifting to myself and others. And this is also when we're talking about titles you give to yourself. A good example is my own title. The golden one means incorruptible one. This is my title, which I strive to uphold. Had I not had it, you would perhaps not even have listened to this now, because I wouldn't have used good magic on myself. So the good magic I used was that I set up a goal for myself that I reinforced by calling myself that until it became a title that I can comfortably hold and say, yeah, I live up to the ideals embodied in this name, in this title. Same thing when we're talking about politics. If we're talking about such a word as indigenous, that is something that they, the left, the default liberals, they do not use for Europeans. So you can hear them say, the Sami people, they are the indigenous population of Sweden, which is not the case. They came later than the population groups that would form the Swedish people. Same thing if they say the Maoris, they are the indigenous population of New Zealand, despite them coming later than the population they brutally conquered. And they came later, by the way, than the Saxons came to England, for example. But they don't want to use the term indigenous, because they want to keep that potent word magic for the groups they care about, so for non-white groups. And to use another example about words, some powerful hostile word magic, you can look at the word racist. This is a word that can literally destroy your life. If you get, perhaps not now as I make this at the very end of 2024, the word, it has, thank the gods, it has finally lost some of its potency, but if you go back a few years or 10 years or something like that and someone called you a racist, most white men, they back down in fear, they cowered like little rabbits. If someone pulled out that particular weapon, the weapon of racism, to be called a racist, the end of the world. And the best protection here is to simply not care if someone calls you a mean name. So same thing, if someone were to call you a heretic, you have blasphemed against the church. You don't believe in the virgin birth of Jesus or something like that. 500 years ago, this would have been a big scandal. Today, not such a big deal. So if someone calls you a heretic today, chances are that you will not care overly much, unless of course you're a zealous Christian. But the main point I want to make here is that you should view the accusation of racism as you would if someone calls you a heretic. It's something that it doesn't really bother you all too much. Then you can say, aha, okay, I don't believe that all races are the same. If you call me a racist, I really don't care. So this is how you can approach it, and this is also how you can take power away from them when they try to bully you in this way. Because this is something you need to keep in mind, that the ones who use the term racism, they are bullies, and they always go for the weak ones, like any bully. So just stand up to them, show that their words don't have any hold over you, and if someone uses the term racism, they are not a good person in the least. They are a bully and a coward and overall a very unsympathetic character. Now, the book contains many more interesting insights. I just wanted to share a few of them, talk a bit about them, share my own perspective on them, and again, I can highly recommend the book. I thought it was really good, even for a venerable ancient that has been in the game for such a long time as myself. I found it very valuable, and it's written in a very accessible manner, which I appreciate, because if you can explain something in an accessible manner, it means you've understood the concepts well, and Mike Maxwell here, he clearly has. So again, I can highly recommend the book. So that all being said, I thank you all for listening. Thank you for your support as always, for those of you who are on Gumroad and Subscribestar. If you would like more podcast episodes, then I humbly suggest that you sign up on either Gumroad or Subscribestar. That's also a great way to support my metapolitical work. I have been demonetized since 2019 on YouTube, so it's a good way to compensate for this great travesty. Anyway, do check out the other episodes. I have, as I said, over 50 of them, quite a bit of collected insights there, so do check it out. Do also read Dauntless and Demigod Mentality, absolutely mandatory reading. So with that all being said, I wish you all a happy Yule, Merry Christmas, good Yule, and I will talk to you in the next podcast episode. XOXO, boom!